History kept Josephine Baker in the banana skirt because the costume was easier to remember than the woman wearing it. Paris celebrated her as an exotic sensation, filtered through the racial fantasies of the time. But Baker was never only the image audiences paid to see. During the war, the fame that opened drawing rooms and diplomatic doors also gave her access to information she passed to French intelligence. Yet public memory still returns first to the feathers, the scandal, and the performance. That is the injustice in her legacy. History preserved the spectacle and reduced the discipline, courage, and intelligence behind it. Josephine Baker did not simply escape the image the world created for her. She learned how to turn it into power. In 1925, Josephine Baker arrived in Paris with La Revue Nègre. She was 19 years old, American, Black, and already familiar with the limits imposed by segregation. France offered opportunities the United States had denied her, but the welcome came with its own conditions. Paris wanted jazz, speed, novelty, and a version of Black modernity it could consume without examining the racial ideas behind its appetite. Baker understood the stage better than many people watching her. Her dancing used sharp angles, comic exaggeration, speed, and control. She could make a movement appear loose while keeping command of its timing. Audiences often treated the result as instinct rather than technique. That misunderstanding became part of the product. The press described her through words such as wild, primitive, and exotic. Language that praised her while placing her outside the standards applied to white performers. The image grew larger at the Folies Bergère, where the banana skirt became attached to her name. The costume was simple enough to reproduce in photographs, posters, and later histories. It made Baker instantly recognizable. It also reduced a skilled performer to one object that carried decades of racial fantasy. The skirt did not create the system around her, it revealed it. European audiences were already fascinated by African art, jazz, colonial imagery, and the Black female body. Baker entered that market at the moment it wanted a symbol. She became famous because she could satisfy the demand while controlling the stage with unusual confidence. That control matters. Baker was not a passive figure placed before an audience without choices. She selected movements, built comic rhythms, studied reactions, and learned what attention could purchase. She understood that fame brought money, travel, and access. It also brought surveillance, simplification, and a public that believed the image belonged to them. Paris did not simply discover Josephine Baker. It helped manufacture a version of her that could be sold night after night. The public version was carefree, sexual, modern, and available. The woman herself was more disciplined and more alert than that version allowed. The contradiction made her powerful and vulnerable at the same time. The image opened doors that would have remained closed to an unknown Black woman. It also encouraged powerful people to underestimate her judgment. They saw the costume and missed the calculation behind the performance. Baker learned how to use that gap. She turned attention into income and income into independence. She moved through spaces where race and class usually determined who could enter. Her fame gave her contact with officials, artists, diplomats, and wealthy patrons. The public believed it was consuming her. Baker was also learning how power behaved when it thought the performer in the room was harmless. That does not make the racial gaze harmless. The same image that helped her rise also limited how people remembered her. Reviews could praise her body while ignoring her work. Photographs could preserve the costume while removing the context. The market rewarded the version of Baker that required the least explanation. This is why the banana skirt matters. It was not the truth of Josephine Baker. It was the most profitable frame placed around her. The spectacle made her famous. The discipline behind it made her harder to contain. By the time Europe moved toward war, Baker had already learned something her audience had not. Being underestimated could be dangerous, but it could also create access. The rooms that opened because people wanted the star would soon become useful for reasons no theater poster could advertise. When war reached France, Josephine Baker understood that fame could do more than fill a theater. It could open doors, lower suspicion, and carry her into rooms where officials rarely imagined a performer might be listening. The same racial assumptions that had reduced her to spectacle now created an opening. Men who saw only entertainment often failed to ask what she had heard. French intelligence recruited Baker during the Second World War. Her public identity gave her access to diplomats, military officers, receptions, and embassies. She could travel under the cover of performance, while others watched the star and overlooked the observer. The plan depended on allowing powerful men to trust their own assumptions. Later accounts describe officials treating her luggage with less suspicion than they would have shown an unknown courier. Costumes, sheet music, and trunks belonged to the ordinary equipment of a touring celebrity. That familiarity became useful. Baker did not need to hide in the usual sense. She needed officials to keep seeing what they expected to see. The advantage was never safe. A single careful search could expose the operation and place other people at risk. Baker understood that celebrity could lower suspicion without removing danger. She used the access her fame created while accepting the limits of that protection. At diplomatic gatherings, she listened for information about troop movements, military sites, and Axis plans. Her celebrity encouraged people to speak freely in her presence. The performer once treated as novelty now entered rooms where war and policy were discussed. She remembered details, passed them to her contacts, and turned attention into cover. Some of the information had to cross borders. Baker and her handlers used methods that resembled the normal clutter of a performer's life. Reports were written in invisible ink across sheets of music. To an official scanning her papers, the pages looked like scores prepared for a performance. The useful material sat inside something familiar. Other accounts describe messages pinned inside her clothing and photographs hidden among personal garments. These details are often repeated because they sound dramatic, but the method was practical. Border officers expected dresses, music, and personal items from Josephine Baker. They did not expect military intelligence. The system had trained audiences to see her as body, costume, rhythm, and amusement. Baker turned that narrow vision against those who relied on it. Spectacle was the packaging. Underestimation became operational cover. She was not passing information because the stage had become irrelevant. The stage made the work possible. Fame created movement. Invitations created access. Her public image gave her a reason to travel with assistants, trunks, papers, and costumes. The identity sold for entertainment became useful to a resistance network. Baker also supported free French causes, and worked with the Red Cross. Her wartime service did not fit the public image that had made her famous, but it grew from the same skills. She understood rooms, timing, attention, and the power of being misread. That continuity matters. Baker did not become a serious woman only when she entered wartime service. She had always been serious about performance, independence, and survival. The war revealed capacities that the entertainment market had chosen not to notice. The risk remained present in every journey. Discovery would not have meant a canceled engagement or a hostile review. It could have ended her work and exposed the people depending on her. The surviving record shows that she continued despite that danger. After the war, France recognized her service. Baker received the Croix de Guerre, the Resistance Medal, and was named a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. The medals recorded a history that publicity photographs had missed. They testified to discipline, courage, and political purpose. Yet even those honors could be simplified. The public could turn them into another glamorous detail attached to a famous name. Baker's real achievement was more demanding. She had used the very image built around her to serve a cause beyond performance. The enemy underestimated her because it confused glamour with emptiness. Baker understood the mistake and used it. The woman once sold as spectacle had learned how to make spectacle serve something larger than fame. France could honor her as a resistance figure. But those medals carried little authority against the racial order waiting when she returned to the United States. Europe could honor Josephine Baker with medals, but those medals did not carry equal force across the Atlantic. In France, she could be praised as a star and decorated for service. In the United States, race still decided where she could stay, where she could eat, where she could enter, and how far fame was allowed to protect her. A queen in Paris could still be treated as unwelcome in New York. Baker had left the United States in the 1920s, in part because racism limited both her work and her daily life. Paris gave her money, greater professional freedom, and a larger stage. It also allowed her to build a public identity beyond the narrow roles available to Black performers at home. But success in Europe did not erase the structure waiting in America. When she returned as an international celebrity, segregation still placed race above achievement. That contrast exposed the limit of fame. Newspapers could praise her Paris triumphs, while hotels and restaurants denied her ordinary service. A first-class ticket could bring her across an ocean. It could not guarantee a room key, a table, or equal treatment after arrival. She could fill a theater and still be reduced in a moment to the category America had prepared for her, long before it cared about her success. The insult was not abstract. Baker faced discrimination at hotels, restaurants, and clubs that welcomed white guests with less status and fewer achievements. Her name had value at the box office, but management could still treat her as if that value ended at the dining room door. That is what made her position so revealing. She was too famous to ignore, yet not protected from humiliation. One of the best-known disputes came at New York's Stork Club. Baker said she waited to be served while white guests around her received attention. The club denied racial discrimination, and the exact details of individual intent remained debated. But the larger structure was not in doubt. Segregation and unequal treatment shaped American public life. and Baker's complaint made visible what many Black Americans already knew without needing a famous witness. The episode mattered because it stripped away the illusion that European acclaim had changed her standing at home. She could arrive with contracts, luggage, and international prestige. A manager could still answer all of that with delay, silence, or refusal. The slight might be delivered in polite language, but the meaning remained clear. Money could buy a first-class ticket. It could not purchase dignity from a system built to withhold it. Baker did not accept that treatment as the price of coming home. She began using the same celebrity that promoters valued as leverage against segregated venues. If a theater wanted her name on its marquee, it had to face conditions as well as applause. She insisted on non-segregated audiences and refused to perform where Black patrons were excluded or confined to separate sections. The stage became part of the argument. That choice altered the balance of power. Segregation usually forced Black performers to work inside rules set by white owners. Baker reversed the transaction. She told promoters that her labor was not available on any terms they pleased. If they wanted Josephine Baker, they had to reconsider the rules governing the seats. That was not symbolic resistance. It was a direct use of bargaining power. There was a cost. Refusing venues could mean lost money, damaged relationships, and fewer future bookings. It could also create enemies among men who wanted entertainment without challenge. Baker accepted the professional risk and continued demanding integrated audiences. She had not crossed oceans, built a career, and served France in wartime, only to stand quietly inside a segregated room. Her stand also corrected the image America preferred. The public could admire the glamorous expatriate as long as she remained entertainment. The moment she challenged racial rules, the performer became political. That shift revealed something important. Her commitment to racial equality did not begin at the March on Washington. Fame gave that commitment a larger platform. This was the first major crack in the fantasy that success had freed her from race. Europe had turned Baker into a symbol of modern glamour. America reminded her that celebrity did not cancel hierarchy. It only made the contradiction harder to hide. The same woman celebrated abroad could still be treated as a problem at home. Baker answered by making the stage a place of negotiation. The audience was no longer separate from the politics of the room. Who entered, where they sat, and which door they used became part of the performance contract. The woman once sold as spectacle now used spectacle to force institutional change. She did not ask the system to admire her more. She demanded that it treat Black patrons differently. That refusal drew attention beyond theaters and hotel lobbies. Her challenge was public, economic, and impossible for powerful institutions to dismiss as a private grievance. Once an entertainer began turning fame into pressure, authorities started watching the threat behind the applause. Once Josephine Baker made segregation part of her contracts, the conflict moved beyond theaters and hotels. Her protest entered government files. The performer once dismissed as spectacle was now being examined as a political risk. Under J. Edgar Hoover, the Federal Bureau of Investigation collected information on Baker during the early 1950s. The surviving records concern immigration, security questions, political associations, and her criticism of American racism abroad. Officials noted where she traveled, whom she met, and which causes received her public support. The attention did not prove that Baker worked for a communist organization. It showed how quickly civil rights activism could be placed inside the language of national security. In the Cold War climate, association could become suspicion, and suspicion could damage a career without producing a formal charge. Baker's international standing made her harder to contain. She could describe segregation before audiences outside the United States. Her words exposed the distance between American democratic claims and the treatment of Black citizens at home. That criticism carried more weight because it came from a woman known across Europe. A voice condemning injustice could therefore be recast as disloyalty. The question shifted away from whether Baker's accusations were true. Officials and columnists began asking whether she was loyal enough to make them. That change served a purpose. Racism became less visible once the debate moved toward communism. The country no longer had to answer her criticism directly. It could examine her associations instead. Public hostility intensified after the Stork Club dispute. Columnist Walter Winchell attacked Baker and connected her with communist sympathies. The accusation entered a media culture shaped by the Red Scare, where one label could affect contracts, travel, and reputation before evidence was tested. The wording mattered more than proof. A promoter did not need to know whether the charge was accurate. He only needed to fear canceled bookings or government attention. A venue could step away while presenting the decision as business rather than politics. FBI records and later accounts show that scrutiny continued as Baker's American engagements became harder to sustain. Federal agencies shared information concerning her travel and contacts. Yet the FBI did not control every action taken against her. The State Department held authority over the documents that allowed a foreign citizen to enter and work in the country. Baker had become a French citizen. That status gave American officials a legal mechanism that did not require a public trial. Entry and work authorization could be treated as privileges subject to government approval. During the early 1950s, her permission to work in the United States was withdrawn. Engagements disappeared, and access to a valuable market narrowed. The action did not answer her argument about segregation. It reduced the number of American audiences able to hear it. That distinction is important. The government did not need to prove that Baker had committed a crime. Immigration authority offered a quieter method. A denied document could produce isolation without a verdict and punishment without a courtroom. The system had turned her international identity against her. France had granted her citizenship and later honored her wartime service. The United States could therefore treat her return as conditional, even though she had been born there and remained connected to its racial struggle. The consequences extended beyond travel. Promoters saw danger around her name. Journalists repeated the communist label. Venues could cancel appearances without admitting that her civil rights work had become inconvenient. Government scrutiny shaped reputation, and reputation narrowed opportunity. Baker did not respond by abandoning her position. She continued speaking against segregation and refused to present equality as foreign subversion. Her choices remained clear, even while institutions controlled where she could work and which audiences could hear her. The pressure also exposed the limits of celebrity. Fame could turn a restaurant dispute into national news. It could not prevent federal agencies from opening files, recording contacts, or influencing access to the American market. The same public image that had once made Baker appear harmless now made her words harder to ignore. A famous entertainer criticizing segregation could reach people beyond political organizations and formal meetings. Her voice traveled through newspapers, theaters, and international networks. That reach was the threat. Baker had joined performance to political speech. The woman marketed as entertainment was using the attention surrounding her to expose the nation's racial order. Officials could not easily control the meaning of her fame, so they tried to control her access. Distance became the practical solution. If Baker remained outside the country, her influence might weaken. If American stages closed, her criticism might lose part of its audience. But isolation did not erase the record she had created. It did not remove the contracts she had challenged, the discrimination she had named, or the contradiction she had exposed. More than a decade later, in August of 1963, Josephine Baker returned to a national platform. She did not arrive to dance. She arrived in uniform, prepared to speak. More than a decade after American officials treated Josephine Baker as a political risk, she returned to Washington. On August 28, 1963, hundreds of thousands gathered between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial to demand jobs, freedom, and equal citizenship. The day would later be remembered above all for Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. Josephine Baker arrived with a different weight. She had lived the contradiction the march was naming. She had left the United States because racism narrowed both her work and her daily life. She had returned as an international celebrity and still been reminded that fame could not cancel the color line. Her presence mattered for another reason. Baker was not speaking as a newcomer to the movement. She had challenged segregated venues, used contracts as leverage, and endured years of scrutiny when her criticism grew too public to ignore. She had seen America from outside as well as inside. That gave her a rare position. She could compare the nation's promises with the way it behaved. She could do so before a crowd large enough that the contrast could not be dismissed as a private grievance. When Baker stepped forward, she did not wear the costume history had repeated most often. She wore her free French uniform. Her medals rested across her chest, including honors linked to her wartime service. That choice corrected an old lie without needing to argue about it. The woman long reduced to an exotic body now stood before America in military dress, carrying visible proof of discipline, service, and political seriousness. The contrast was sharp. The banana skirt had helped turn her into a global image. The uniform forced the audience to see that the image had never been the whole woman. Baker did not need to renounce performance to become credible. The mistake belonged to a culture that had treated glamour as evidence of emptiness. By appearing in uniform, she made that mistake harder to keep repeating. Her remarks drew from memory, not mythology. She spoke about the country that had denied her dignity before it celebrated her fame. She recalled being welcomed abroad while being turned away at home. She had slept in palaces in Europe, yet in the United States she had still faced the insult of closed doors, delayed service, and segregated spaces. The power of that comparison did not rest on bitterness alone. It exposed a structural embarrassment. A nation that called itself a leader of freedom had forced one of its most famous daughters to seek ordinary respect elsewhere. Baker also understood that the march was not about her alone. She praised those who had remained in the United States and carried the struggle forward without the protection of international fame. That mattered. She did not present herself as the center of the movement. She placed herself inside a larger history of Black resistance. She honored those who had stayed, organized, marched, and endured retaliation at home. What made her appearance so important was the way it joined the separate versions of Josephine Baker that the public had preferred to keep apart. The crowd did not see only the Paris star. It did not see only the wartime operative honored by France. It did not see only the Black expatriate who had spoken against segregation. For a few minutes, those identities stood together in one figure. The entertainer, the veteran of the resistance, and the civil rights advocate occupied the same stage and refused simplification. That was the deeper correction. The public had often treated Baker in fragments because fragments were easier to market. One image sold tickets. One image filled newspaper columns. One image kept complexity under control. At the march, complexity stood in full view. The body once consumed as spectacle now carried medals. The woman, once pushed toward the edge of American public life, now spoke at the center of one of its defining political gatherings. It would be easy to turn that moment into a neat victory. It was not that simple. Her appearance did not erase the years of exclusion, surveillance, or lost work. It did not settle the question of how America would remember her. Still, the moment mattered because Baker reclaimed visibility on her own terms. She was no longer being looked at in the way Paris had first taught the world to look at her. She was using the stage to say what the stage had once been used to hide. That reversal had taken decades. It had cost her money, access, and professional security. But it placed her voice inside the national record in a form that could not be reduced to novelty. The same woman, once sold as sensation, had returned to Washington not to entertain the country, but to confront it. She had learned how to survive being watched, and now she used that visibility with precision. The image still existed. She simply refused to let the image speak for her anymore. Yet public recognition did not remove the pressures gathering elsewhere in her life. The ideals Baker defended in speeches would soon be tied to a personal project far larger than applause. She had challenged racism on public stages. Next, she would try to build her vision into everyday life, and that choice would bring its own cost. Josephine Baker had stood at the March on Washington in a French uniform, speaking about freedom before a national audience. Yet the ideals she defended did not remain on a platform. She tried to build them into daily life. At Château de Milan, Baker created what she called the Rainbow Tribe. She adopted 12 children from different countries and backgrounds, presenting the family as proof that race did not have to determine belonging. The project joined motherhood, politics, and public demonstration inside one household. The children came from countries including Japan, Finland, Colombia, and France. Their lives were brought together on the grounds of the chateau, where Baker hoped difference could become ordinary rather than threatening. She was not only speaking about coexistence, she was trying to make it visible. The idea reflected both conviction and ambition. Baker wanted the family to challenge racial prejudice through daily life. Visitors could see children from different backgrounds eating, studying, and growing up together. The household became part of her public message. But the project also carried demands that admiration could not meet. 12 children required food, education, clothing, staff, medical care, and long-term stability. The chateau required repairs, taxes, wages, and maintenance. Baker was still a performer, but she was also supporting a household, managing property, and financing a public experiment. The costs continued whether she was performing or not. Baker did not have a corporation carrying those obligations. She relied on concerts, appearances, and the income her name could still generate. The same fame that once paid for costumes and international travel was now expected to support children, employees, land, and a humanitarian vision. The Rainbow Tribe attracted press attention and visitors. The family could be praised in magazines and presented as evidence of Baker's idealism. Yet public interest did not provide dependable funding. Attention arrived in waves. Bills arrived every month. That difference became harder to ignore. Baker made choices that increased the pressure. She expanded the project and maintained a standard of life that required steady income. Her idealism gave the undertaking purpose, but it also made retreat difficult. Closing part of the estate or reducing the household would have affected people who depended on her. This was not a simple story of generosity punished by an ungrateful world. Baker had agency. She continued financing the project even after its costs exceeded the income available to support it. The record shows a woman trying to sustain too many roles at once. She was a performer, activist, mother, landowner, and public symbol. Each role required time and money. None could be abandoned without consequence. The chateau also became part of the spectacle surrounding her. Visitors came to see the famous entertainer's unusual family and the estate built around it. The project carried a political message, but it also depended on public curiosity. Baker had once turned spectacle into leverage. At Les Milandes, spectacle again became part of the financial structure. That arrangement was unstable. The estate needed continuing attention to remain profitable. Baker's income could rise after successful performances and fall when bookings declined. The household could not adjust as quickly. Debts accumulated. The chateau became tied to obligations Baker could no longer control. A woman once associated with Parisian luxury was now fighting to preserve the property that housed her family and her political vision. The entertainment market had rewarded Baker when she offered sensation. It was less reliable when she asked it to support a long-term social project. A performance could sell tickets in one evening. A household built around racial coexistence required planning, structure, and support across years. The difference exposed another limit of fame. Public affection could celebrate the Rainbow Tribe without assuming responsibility for its survival. Baker carried that responsibility herself. Eventually, the debts overtook the project. Château des Milandes was seized, and Baker lost the home she had connected to her children and her political vision. The loss was material, but it also changed the public meaning of the experiment. Critics could frame the collapse as proof that the idea had been foolish. Admirers could turn it into a story of sacrifice. Neither version captured the full record. The project contained courage, control, excess, and risk at the same time. The Rainbow Tribe remained evidence of Baker's refusal to accept racial division as natural. It also revealed how far she was willing to extend herself to make that refusal visible. Her fame had once opened borders, palaces, and diplomatic rooms. It could not stop creditors. Baker had challenged segregation, served France, and spoken before the nation. Yet one of her most personal efforts left her without the home built around it. The ideal survived as a symbol. The estate did not. Help would come from Princess Grace of Monaco. But before it arrived, Baker learned that applause could honor a vision without keeping it alive. When Château de Milan was lost, Josephine Baker faced a problem that applause could not solve. She needed a home for herself and the children who still depended on her. Help came from Princess Grace of Monaco, the former Grace Kelly, who had become one of Baker's friends. Princess Grace offered practical support. She helped Baker secure a home at Roquebrune Cap Martin near Monaco and provided financial assistance during a period when Baker's income no longer matched her obligations. The arrangement gave the family stability after the loss of the estate. The gesture mattered because it protected Baker from becoming a public charity case. She received shelter without being turned into another spectacle of decline. The support gave her time to decide what came next, rather than forcing an immediate return to work under humiliating conditions. Both women had lived under public images created by powerful institutions, though their experiences were not the same. Hollywood had measured Grace through beauty and discipline before royalty imposed another set of expectations. Baker had been sold through race, novelty, and desire. Each had learned that admiration could become a demand for permanent performance. Monaco became Baker's final base. It did not erase the debts, the loss of Les Milans, or the strain of supporting a large family. It offered privacy and enough security for her to work again. Baker did not surrender agency inside that protection. She accepted help, then used the room it created. The distinction is important. Princess Grace did not restore Baker's career for her. She helped make another choice possible. By 1975, Baker was preparing a retrospective production in Paris. The show marked 50 years since her arrival in France. It brought together the roles public memory had often kept separate: dancer, singer, wartime servant of France, civil rights advocate, mother, and international figure. She was not returning to imitate the young performer Paris had first consumed. The production allowed her to present the life that had followed that first image. The show opened at the Bobino on April 8th. Princess Grace attended, along with performers and public figures from several generations. Their presence reflected a reach of Baker's career and the respect she still commanded. The response was strong. Baker moved through songs and memories drawn from 5 decades on stage. Time had changed her voice and body, but the authority of her presence remained. The audience was not watching a forgotten attraction brought back for nostalgia. It was watching an artist reclaim the order of her own history. That return corrected an old imbalance. For years, the world had treated Baker as an image before treating her as an artist. At Bobino, she controlled the material, the sequence, and the frame. She decided how the audience would encounter her past. The performance did not erase the financial collapse that preceded it. Debt had taken property and disrupted the household she had built. Yet the loss of the chateau had not removed the value of her name or the reach of her work. Photographs from the opening showed Baker surrounded by flowers. Reviews praised the return. The moment appeared to offer something her career had rarely provided: recognition without immediate reduction. It lasted only days. Soon after the opening, Baker suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. She was taken to Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris and did not regain consciousness. Josephine Baker died on April 12, 1975. She was 68. The timing encouraged a romantic story about a performer giving everything to one final stage. That version is easy to repeat, but it turns a medical event into symbolism. Her death was sudden. The achievement lay in the return itself. An older Black woman, once presented as novelty, had commanded a Paris stage after war. Political surveillance, racial conflict, financial collapse, and decades of public simplification. She did not return as the image history had preserved. She returned with control over the story attached to that image. Princess Grace had provided shelter when fame no longer guaranteed protection. Paris then gave Baker a final audience. Neither act canceled the damage that came before. Together, they allowed her last public chapter to contain agency rather than defeat. She died days after the applause. The struggle over what Josephine Baker meant did not end with her. Nearly half a century later, France would attempt to settle that argument with a place in the Pantheon. Nearly half a century after Josephine Baker died, France placed her name inside the Pantheon. On November 30th, 2021, a ceremonial coffin entered beneath the French flag. Baker became the first Black woman honored there. The ceremony recognized Baker as a performer, resistance worker, and civil rights advocate whose achievements public memory had often placed behind the spectacle. France was correcting part of the record, but the recognition arrived long after Baker could receive it herself. The coffin contained no remains. Her family chose not to move her body from Monaco. Instead, the cenotaph held soil from St. Louis, Paris, Les Milandes, and Monaco. France could place Baker inside its national story, but it could not take possession of her body. That absence gave the ceremony its sharpest meaning. Institutions had spent decades turning Baker into symbols they could use. First came the exotic performer. Later came the war heroine and national icon. The Pantheon honored real achievements, but it also showed how easily a complicated woman could be reduced again. In 2025, Paris marked 50 years since Baker's death and 100 years since her arrival in the city. A public mural returned her face to the streets, yet commemoration could not decide which version the crowd would remember first. The world saw the costume before the discipline. It saw the sensation before the political force. Newspapers, promoters, and entertainment markets all benefited from the smaller version because it was easier to sell. But Baker was never only the image they bought. She understood spectacle, used it as leverage, and resisted the limits placed around it. She turned fame into access, access into service, and visibility into political speech. The public image opened doors, but she decided what to carry through them. The empty coffin offered the final correction. France could honor her name, but the woman remained beyond institutional ownership. Josephine Baker was not powerful because the world finally stopped looking. She was powerful because she learned how to survive being watched without letting the image become her entire life. History kept the banana skirt because it was easy. The woman was harder to hold. If this story changed how you see Josephine Baker, like this video and subscribe to Gilded Women. Did history honor the full woman, or only replace one useful image with another? Share your thoughts in the comments.